Hello and welcome to CorpusCast, part of the Aston Originals series, providing fresh perspectives from Aston University experts. My name is Robbie Love, and I'm a lecturer in English language here at Aston University. Now, I'm a corpus linguist, meaning that I study linguistic patterns, trends, and variations using large samples of data, of language data. So on behalf of the Aston Corpus Linguistics Research Group, welcome to the show. Now, CorpusCast is the show all about corpus linguistics and what it can do for society. In this series, I speak with top researchers in the field to find out more about how corpus linguistics can be applied to a diverse range of areas. In this episode of CorpusCast, our topic is how corpus linguistics contributes to research in the area of aviation communication. And we have not one, not two, but three guests joining us today. Joining me for the entire duration of today's episode is Professor Eric Friginal. Eric is Professor of Applied Linguistics and Head of Department of English and Communication at the Hong Kong Polytechnic University. Before moving to Hong Kong, he was Professor and Director of International Programs at the Department of Applied Linguistics and ESL at Georgia State University in the USA. Now, Eric specializes in applied corpus linguistics, quantitative research, language policy and planning, technology and language teaching, sociolinguistics, cross-cultural communication, discipline-specific writing, and spoken professional discourse in the workplace. Not many things left that he doesn't do. Most relevant to our topic today is his recent publication, English in Global Aviation, Context, Research and Pedagogy with Elizabeth Matthews and Jennifer Roberts. And he is the founding co-editor-in-chief of Applied Corpus Linguistics Journal with Paul Thompson from the University of Birmingham, just down the road from me. We also have two other guests, as I mentioned, Malila Prado and Andrew Schneider. They'll be joining us a little bit later on, so you'll hear more about them in a little bit. This has been, I must say, a bit of an international operation to get us all together to record this episode. Eric is in Oregon in the USA over on the west. Andy is in Florida. I'm of course in the UK, and Malila is in China. So getting us all together has been a challenge, but we've made it, and I'm very grateful, especially to our first guest, Eric, who is calling in very early in the morning. So I'm very pleased to welcome Eric Friginal to CorpusCast. Hello, hi Eric, welcome.
Hi, Robbie. Welcome. Thank you so much for inviting me and our group here. We are big fans of your CorpusCast and what you're doing. You're doing an amazing job, so please keep it going. I'm happy to join you today.
Thank you. And thank you so much for getting up very early to join us to record this episode. I really do appreciate it. Let's get started then. My first question is a question I ask all of our guests on the show. What does corpus linguistics mean to you?
It's a great question. It's something to ask nowadays, especially given what's going on. You know, a lot of things going on with what is, for example, computational linguistics, what is natural language processing, what is language and computers, those kinds of fields in applied linguistics. And I go back to my definition, a definition that I learned from my mentor, Doug Biber in Northern Arizona University, that actually tells me that corpus linguistics is a research approach in the study of spoken and written discourse. It supports empirical investigation, frequency-based investigations of naturally occurring language and use. And I like it. There's a lot of words to unpack and phrases to further look at, but it's a very simple thing. It's a research approach. It's something that allows us to make our research more technical. We're using great data. And in terms of this type of data, there is something that we follow, you know, and how we collect. Something that's very important to me is also to emphasize that whenever we work on corpus-based research and collect corpora, it goes back to what we wanted to accomplish, right? So there's this need for a really amazing, awesome, purposeful set of research questions. We collect them, we analyze them because we wanted to answer those questions. So it's something that to me is technical, it's scientific, it's research oriented, but then at the same time, it's so practical. We have a lot of application, and it's whatever we do with those resources and the results and the frequencies that we obtain that will take us to the next level, in my opinion.
It's really interesting what you said there, or crucially what you didn't say, which is a lot of the definitions traditionally that you see emphasize the size of the data set, and they often say it's a really large linguistic data set. Is that something that you would agree with, or would you say that corpus methods are applied to regardless of the size of the sample?
That's a really interesting question. In our field, we have defined corpora or a corpus, with size in mind. And we came up with specialized corpus or specialized corpora. What do these collections mean, right? That's why I give it back, Robbie, to research questions and what we wanted to accomplish. There's a question of representativeness, which is very, very important. Over the years, Biber defined representativeness in the 1980s with some technical terms like, some statistical considerations in terms of, what is representative based on linguistic features or based on what you wanted to count and things like that. But we have gotten better now, right? In terms of just really collecting. It's almost like we can collect everything, especially if it's written discourse. But we still struggle when it comes to spoken interaction, spoken discourse. So I feel like, it's relative. I want to argue that to capture representativeness, that you should have a great design concept. There has to be principle in what you're collecting, and that ultimately you're able to show that what you have collected will represent a particular population. So there will be a population in what we are studying that will only require a certain number of texts. If you're looking at historical texts, for example, like some letters or recordings of day-to-day observations about the weather in the 16th century or something like that. Well, you don't have a lot of data. So what you have collected may be enough to represent that register that you are studying.
And how did you get started in corpus linguistics yourself?
I mentioned earlier that I studied under Doug Biber as my mentor. So I was representing Northern Arizona University. I actually studied with Doug from my MA, and then I ended up also going back to NAU to do my PhD. So I was a student of Doug Biber and Randy Reppen from the late 1990s. It was amazing for me. I loved it that, at that period from 1998, relatively it was new. We still did not have amazing tools, and obviously the internet was still relatively new when it comes to how we share data and how corpora could be easily accessed. But I was just really impressed by what people were doing, particularly during the time when they were working on the Longman Grammar book, the Longman Grammar of Spoken and Written English. And I saw like bits and pieces of it when it was being written by all these great researchers and scholars and heroes in our field. And it just really got me going. The whole idea that, we're defining British and American English using all of these patterns, using amazing data. It just really inspired me. And it got me into, what can I do with this type of information and method if I take it to another field, like, my original research on call center interaction, which is spoken over the telephone with speakers from the United States, communicating with customer service agents from the Philippines and India. And so it got me into that area of research where I was mostly focusing on spoken language.
So You mentioned there the work that you've done on call center interaction, which is also fascinating. We could do, maybe one day we should do an episode all about that as well. That's really interesting. But of course, our topic today is about aviation communication, aviation English. I suppose, in short, what is aviation English, and how on earth did you first get interested in this area?
It's networking, and for folks who are watching this, it's the importance of connecting with colleagues who may be in our field or outside in other adjacent fields. And that's what got to me. So I mentioned my call center work with, obviously, over the telephone. It's primarily intercultural, at least in my focus. I wanted to really look at speakers of English who may be identified as second language speakers of English. They have a different first language, communicated with American callers in customer service, right? And so there are parallels, Robbie, when it comes to the whole idea of aviation communication. I mean, aviation English is huge. It's not just pilot and air traffic controller communication. It's bigger than that, right? It's a lot going on when it comes to also written discourse, technical writing in aviation. But I like this whole subsection of pilot and air traffic controller communication. I mean, there's not a lot actually going on. It's not an extensive set of discourse, maybe only during takeoffs and landings when things become really interesting. But there are a lot of implications. So if you take a look at pilots, unfortunately with COVID, it's something that we don't do every day, but I hope we can go back to flying regularly again globally. But we have a lot of flights going on. We have a lot of communication interactions happening with pilots who, again, may not have English as their first language, but this is an area where English has become the official language. So globally, and especially for international flights. So it's something spoken by air traffic controllers on the ground. It's something spoken by pilots and their co-pilots as they fly. And it's a fascinating area of discourse. Our guests, Malila and Andy, are going to be speaking more specifically because this is their area and this is what they're doing in terms of both teaching and analyzing the language. But it's just really so fascinating for me, and my training in discourse analysis and applied linguistics kind of got me into this whole area. I had to learn a lot. It wasn't easy. So it took me a long time. And I'd like to give a shout out to Elizabeth Matthews from Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, and also Jennifer Roberts, also from Embry-Riddle, in getting me into the field, in trusting me, in helping me out, in giving me all the things that I had to learn. Elizabeth worked not only at Embry-Riddle, but also for the International Civil Aviation Organization, or ICAO, under the United Nations. So she was an instrument in terms of just getting me in the field and trusting me, and we collaborated, and the rest is history.
Wow, thank you. That's a great point, I think, to bring in our first additional guest, I should say, to join Eric and I for this episode. We have joining us in a moment Dr. Malila Prado, who's assistant professor at the Beijing Normal University, Hong Kong Baptist University United International College. She's worked as an English teacher for over 20 years and specializes in, of course, aviation English. Malila researches the language used by pilots and air traffic control operators in abnormal situations using corpus linguistics. So please welcome Malila. Hello, Malila.
Hello, Robbie. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you, Eric, for bringing me in.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for joining us. And as I mentioned earlier, you're in China, and so we have the opposite situation. It's quite late at night now for you, and I'm sort of stuck in the middle, halfway roughly between Malila and Eric. Thanks, Malila. Eric just sort of gave a very broad introduction there to aviation English. It's been internationally agreed that that people in aviation will all speak this version of English. This sounds like quite a high stakes situation with pilots and air traffic controllers communicating over radio using this agreed standard of English. And presumably errors in communication quite literally could cost lives if something goes wrong. You've done a lot of research in this area, which is really fascinating work. What are some of the kind of risks of communication challenges that might occur if there is a problem of miscommunication? What are the challenges that you've observed? And how does corpus linguistics specifically help you to work in this area?
Okay, well, so we have two questions here.
Yeah.
But let me try to answer the first one about the risks that communication errors can result in. So yes, they can result in accidents, but language, I think that the biggest problem is related to the communications between pilots and air traffic controllers in standard phraseology or aeronautical phraseology. That's what Eric said, that it's very standardized, it's documented, it's mandatory. Pilots and air traffic controllers have to use it. But the accidents that have been registered as problematic in terms of language, they were dealing with phraseology, that people were not respecting, the pilots or air traffic controllers were not respecting phraseology, or they didn't know how to communicate or how to use phraseology in English, how to use the standards in English. That's the reason why those mistakes happen. But just as Eric said, there is more to it. It's the problem is not it's not only phraseology. Again, Elizabeth Matthews, that Eric has already mentioned, Elizabeth Matthews has been conducting research on databases of air crash investigations. So we also have this reported in Eric's books with Elizabeth and Jennifer. So those databases, they show that language was an issue in other accidents, not only for air traffic controllers and pilots' communication, but also related to pilots in the cockpit and the flight deck, or communications, for example, problems with aircraft technicians, maintenance technicians, or the documentation, the translation of documents, for example. But what happens is that they touch on these topics very briefly. They don't make the same efforts to, for example, if an aircraft crashes, they put all the pieces together. They investigate pilots' private lives. They investigate air traffic controllers' pilots' lives. They investigate everything that they can. But when it comes to language, it's very superficial. And in the conclusions of the reports, the conclusions that are going to show, okay, we have a problem, we need to deal with this problem, they don't mention language. Yes, so this is actually one of the problems that we have to deal with. And but because air traffic controller and pilots communications were the main cause of accidents, or they were more easily found in accidents that happened before, we have what we call LPRs, the language proficiency requirements. So pilots and air traffic controllers have to take a test to prove their English proficiency to operate internationally. And when I started working with aviation English in 2008, I noticed that there was lack of authenticity, the same problems that we have in English teaching all over the world. But when it comes to pilots and air traffic controller communication, I think it's even more serious because of the high stakes that you just mentioned. So what I wanted to do was to investigate what kind of language it is that we have to teach pilots and air traffic controllers that is not only standard phraseology, because standard phraseology has to be dealt with, and Andy can talk about it better, but it has to be dealt with in initial training. For example, pilots and air traffic controllers need to learn how to communicate using phraseology. But I was interested in what ICAO said or mentioned in the LPRs as the English that pilots and air traffic controllers need to use when phraseology is not enough. That's the reason why I investigated abnormal situations, because abnormal situations are not prescribed, or they're not described in phraseology, in standard phraseology. So I got communications that presented technical problems or weather problems with passengers. So they needed to use language that went beyond standard phraseology. And
So
then I analyze. Sorry?
When you say standard phraseology, just to clarify, you're talking just about the routine procedural communications of a regular operation.
Yes,
Yeah.
cleared for takeoff, cleared to land, climb to flight level 070, this kind of language that is standardized. So it's, they are made in very simple chunks of language. Yes, so this is the kind of thing that is part of the routine. They have to do it. They have to comply with it. But if something goes wrong, and that is the problem, because if something goes wrong, language can help avoid the problem, because a problem never happens, an accident never happens because of one problem only. It's a chain of events. So language can help break this chain of events. And this is the language that I was interested in studying, because this is the language that we need to deal with in the classroom to pilots and air traffic controllers. And when I started working with pilots and air traffic controllers, I found materials or other teachers teaching, for example, you are at the airport and a passenger is lost. The passenger is looking for, I don't know, the check-in counter. What do you say to the passenger? And this is not aviation English. Yes. Oh, no, but it's a pilot and he's at an airport and there's a passenger, so it is aviation English. So there was this confusion about what aviation English or what kind of English we need to teach to pilots and air traffic controllers. So this is the reason why I used corpus linguistics to investigate this language, to try to understand how they use language and what language they use to communicate over problems.
So you analyze transcripts of interactions between pilots and air traffic controllers, specifically in unusual situations where something abnormal is happening, and you're trying to work out how they're able to communicate what's going on and resolve the issue. And does that mean you've also unfortunately looked at transcripts of cases where things have gone wrong and there actually has been an accident and lives have been lost?
Yes. And unfortunately, this is part of the process. I didn't want to do that because my initial intention was to bring that material to the classroom, and it's not very nice for me to show, transcripts of colleagues of my students, that passed away. Yeah. This is not nice, but I decided to. In the beginning, when I started compiling the corpus, I noticed I was just looking for abnormal situations without any kind of standards to what kind of situations I'm going to look for. And I ended up with a lot of engine problems.
Okay.
So what I decided to do was to look for a document also by ICAO that standardizes accident reports. And then I have, I think it's 33 categories. And I decided to look initially for 3 audio files or I got 3 audio files for each, but then I extended it to 4 audio files because I wanted to add the international component. Okay. Yes, because it's thankfully, it's not very easy it's the emergency situations or abnormal situations are not very common. Yes, aviation is safe. Okay, everyone who's watching.
I wanted to add that, Robbie, and emphasize, Malila, aviation is very, very safe. There are accidents, and in our book, we've actually documented quite a few of these kind of like publicly available information, and those that happened from the 70s to the early 2000s that were high-profile accidents that may have been attributed to language, at least in the perspective of us in applied linguistics or in corpus linguistics. But as Malila was saying, the industry tended to really focus on a lot of other human factors more than language. And I guess the argument there is how difficult it could be to actually really say that it was language that caused this whole accident. One thing to just also briefly add was that we are mentioning ICAO, or the International Civil Aviation Organization in the US. There's the FAA, and many other countries will have some specific administration of how they investigate accidents. Obviously, the airlines are also highly involved in accident investigation. So there are a lot of factors involved. I feel though that, obviously accidents are very important, but we also would just want to describe what happened. So, in the whole process of descriptive linguistics, right? The whole idea that we want to describe how pilots communicate with air traffic controllers. And then we take a look at who the pilots are, what do they represent, what level of language do they have when it comes to English, and then also air traffic controllers. So that's why more and more research, still very important. I'm happy that there are many of our colleagues in Corpus linguistics who are doing this. Marcus B.S. Wenger from Germany has actually defined the linguistic characteristics using corpora of aviation communication, identifying the differences between standard phraseology and plain English. So we're getting there when it comes to description, but we need more. And so I really am a big fan of Malila and what she's doing, particularly in her work with pragmatics and sociolinguistics as well.
Thanks to both of you for making that point. Of course, thankfully, as you say, aviation is incredibly safe, and accidents are thankfully extremely rare. I suppose related to that, avoiding disaster, of course, is one important priority. But as you say, that's very rare these days. Are there other motivations from, say, an airline's perspective? Do they see an opportunity in improving language to improve efficiency, for example? Could this potentially contribute to the business side of airlines if some processes can be, I don't know what you could possibly, what's left to speed up? Presumably there is something that could be made more efficient, and maybe efficient communication could help with that. Does that sort of come up in your work, or is that not really so relevant?
No, it's extremely important, especially because I was teaching pilots, and if you start teaching pilots using contextualized activities or activities that we're taking, that's the reason why I wanted to use the corpus. So when we bring the corpus to the classroom or the investigations to the classroom, the pilots relate to it better and they learn faster. So they can apply those things much faster. And we can also analyze, for example, it's not only about language. Language is not an entity. And that's the importance of corpus linguistics that Eric was talking about before. So when we analyze how language is used and what functions it performs in the flight deck or in that communication, you can teach from those functions, and you can create scenarios with your students to say, okay, so what would you do in this situation? Not in terms of, I'm going to teach them conditionals, for example, but what course of action would you take? Yes, or the contingency plans that are so important in aviation. And so this is what we need to focus on. Yes, and that's how the investigations that I started, they brought me to pragmatics that Eric just mentioned. Yes, and from there I could start developing material that was more effective. And we also have initiatives that Andy can talk about, things that he does at his university, yes, which are very effective as well, as you mentioned, and he has some data to also show.
Well, brilliant. Thank you. And I think that would be a great opportunity actually to bring Andy in. So Malila, thank you for joining us. It's really brilliant to talk to you. We'll see you in a little bit towards the end of the episode. So thank you, and we'll see you soon. And at this point, I'd like to bring in our next guest, Andy Schneider, who is an aviation English coordinator at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University and a doctoral candidate in the Department of Applied Linguistics and ESL at Georgia State University. In fact, one of Eric's PhD students. That's correct, I believe. Yes. So welcome, Andy Schneider. Thank you very much for coming on to CorpusCast. Hello.
Oh, hi, Robbie. Thank you so much. And, I just want to say thanks to everybody for having me on here today and talk about something I'm quite passionate about. And I've been taking notes as everybody's been talking to kind of maybe expand some of the conversation that we've been talking about, maybe fill in some gaps that maybe the listeners are kind of thinking about, because we poked at a few different concepts and I can kind of define them for us a little bit more, or at least use some workable definition. But first, I just want to say thanks. And feel free to cut me off at any point, because I have a habit of going on and on.
Oh no, that's great. That's just what we like on this show. These are really fascinating conversations. Before we start, I must ask if you could tell us a little bit more about the model that's on your desk behind you. What have you got sitting there?
Well, so, I come from a family of pilots. My grandfather was in the Army Air Corps before the Air Force existed in the United States. He was a trainer during World War II. It's the picture up in the background there. My father is a retired pilot for American Airlines. My brother was a former F-16 pilot. He did demo shows and things like that. So I keep that back there in honor of him. I'm also a pilot. And as I was in my PhD coursework in Dr. Friginal's class, I realized that, whoa, there's a really nice workspace here for somebody like me who enjoys corpus linguistics and comes from a flying background, as I do. And so that's what the F-16 there is sitting in the back there. I had to get that requisition for the office here. I'm coming at you from Daytona Beach in Florida.
Oh, wow. That's
so Robbie, if there is one person who's 1 in a million when it comes to this field, it's Andy, because I don't know how many of us Andy is a language teacher, a trained linguist, somebody who has taught overseas for a long, long time. So intercultural communication, corpus, all of those things that we do, right? But then he's also a pilot. So how can you get all of this together in one person? And that's really very rare. And I just saw it as a perfect fit for him. And he'll take this all the way. I'm pretty sure in the future we all are going to be pointing to Andy's work and what he will be doing in this field. So I'm so proud that this is what he's doing.
Well, it certainly puts my hobby of community theatre to shame. I'll put it that way.
Community theater was earlier, because my undergrad degree is in theater. So
there you go. Wow.
I was in Los Angeles for 5 years. I won't tell everybody to look up my stuff that I did when I was working in LA, but another life. Certainly another life.
Is there anything you don't do? That's amazing.
But Robbie, you can understand the overlay between understanding phonetics, phonology, all that stuff that's related to theater. You can bring all that into corpus research and speaking, especially speaking and listening related kind of research. So there's definitely overlap. Sorry to cut you off.
No, you're right. It definitely helps. And I must do an episode about theater at some point. It would be really interesting. So you're sort of balancing two roles, I suppose, at the moment. You're still working on your PhD, and you're now, as we mentioned, an aviation English coordinator at an aeronautical university, Embry-Riddle. What does this involve, and how does corpus linguistics inform your work? You've built a corpus, haven't you, that you're using in your work?
That's right. Yeah. So initially when I came down here, during my PhD work to do research, I was hired to come in here and do a needs analysis and figure out kind of what the department needed for language on a more granular level with one of my colleagues, Rochelle Udell, a fellow PhD student. And from there, they kind of saw my skill set and said, I think that we could utilize you in a larger capacity, because you've got the research background, you've got the flying background. So I originated this position, aviation English coordinator. And I don't want to get too much into the policy, but Eric had touched on the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, back in 2017, adopted this ICAO standard for language proficiency. They renamed it because Americans have to rename everything, make it their own, but it's essentially the same thing. And it's called the Aviation English Language Standards. And so they realized, and this is just something I'll touch on here, is that part of my doctoral work is looking at standard phraseology, which I'll define here in a second, as a second language. It really, in my belief, should be treated as a second language, because as Malila pointed out, native English speakers are deviant in standard phraseology, if we can use that term, and it causes a lot of problems globally. Now, like Eric said, planes are not falling out of the sky. We're safe. Everything's safe. Just reinforce that, it's not chaos up in the cockpit talking. But there is a way to standardize what's happening and cut down on those communication misunderstandings. But certified flight instructors are not trained language teachers. They're not. And yet they're being asked to teach what I believe is a second or foreign language in this kind of English for specific purposes realm. And so I'll offer up this definition. Eric had talked about Marcus Bieswanger. And so he defines standard phraseology as being a reduced set of words and phrases. So it's very limited to what you should be able to use. And each of those phrases has one meaning. So instead of saying, descend and ascend, which would make sense, the send on both of those things could create some kind of miscommunication over the radio. So it's descend and climb. There's a whole host of other things that could be discussed about that. Grammar is deleted often, so they'll cut out verbs or they'll cut out prepositions, things like that. The calls themselves can be very short. There's a frequent use of imperatives when you're looking at verbs. There's a prescribed pronunciation of numbers. One of the most famous ones is Niner, which historically, and whether it's true or not, they say, oh, well, the Germans will say nine means no, so let's use Niner. Who knows if these things are really true or not, but it's kind of fun to reach back to antiquity. And then the letters are pronounced in a very specific way. So we don't say like A, B, C, D, we'll say Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta. And that's prescribed so that people can understand in longer utterances, so to speak, in the word segments to understand what those things are. And so standard phraseology is interesting, especially for pilots, because it's a lot of mom and popper kind of stuff. Like it's this lineage of, well, I learned it this way, and I guess this is right, so you'll do it this way. And so, for native English speakers, there's kind of an assumption built in that because you're a native English speaker, you'll figure it out because it's the same. But research into this, Julia Tripp's got some really interesting research into this, where she took what we'll call naive English speakers without pilot training. And then she took non-native pilots, and the native English speakers had no idea what they were listening to when they were listening to radio calls. They could not repeat them back, which really speaks to the fact that if a person comes in with native English speaking ability and listens to standard phraseology, they need to be taught that. And so that's really been my main drive as aviation English coordinator. But, as Malila does too, I work with non-native English speakers. We try to identify their aviation English skills more globally, but Eric had talked about this too. Aviation English is large. It's a big umbrella. And what we're really talking about here today, it seems like, is what we call aeronautical English. And that's the language that's used over the radio when you're flying. And so it divides kind of into two subsections. The standard phraseology, we can think about that as routine flight, the stuff that happens 95% of the time when you're talking. And then abnormal or emergency flight conditions, which is what Malila does, especially with commercial line pilots. So we asked about what I do. Well, I saw a gap in flight training. And I said, well, if there's problems happening in standard phraseology, which we've identified, it's got to start in flight training. So what does it look like in flight training? What are people learning in flight training? So I built the Corpus flight training, the CFT, in order to investigate how students learn, what language register do they need, or what does it most closely align with? And then what does standard phraseology look like? And then my doctoral work is really looking at how it's acquired. So how can we use corpus to a corpus or corpora to define what is the acquisition of this second language, which I look at as standard phraseology? Because when you get into abnormal flight circumstances for a native English speaker, it's, all bets are off. You can use whatever linguistic tools you want. But when you're in standard phraseology, it's really interesting because it delves into cognitive limitations. Like there's research out there from Corpora that show that, once we get a call that's more than like 2 commands, your brain kind of falls apart. You get a 50% drop in your ability to repeat these calls. So it kind of defines these regulations too. So, and I'm sure that Malila can see that in her research too for commercial line pilots. And so how do you train that? Where do you start out with all that? And for me here, I've been advocating since I came in. So I came in and it was pitched to me, well, we've got a non-native English speaking problem and we need you to help with that problem. And what I've been able to do is to say, I don't think that it's a non-native English speaking problem we've got. I think we've got a lack of standardization and a lack of recognition on the higher levels that this is really a foreign language equivalent to like Esperanto or some other artificial language that needs to be dealt with. But But yeah, that's a lot of what I do here. So we, identify students, train the students, tutor the students. I record flights, debrief students, analyze their language during the flight. Can you understand the instructor? How is your standard phraseology? Identify gaps in fluency. So, it kind of got a lot of hats. We'll just say I found myself to have a lot of hats here.
That's really interesting. So would you say that some of the challenges you've observed in your work there so far really derive from the assumption that L1 speakers of English won't have any problems because they speak English anyway, and that actually it'll just be L2 speakers who need to learn? Is it kind of just an oversight that the L1 speakers of English will just pick it up and they speak English anyway? So what more should they have to learn? Is that where the problem lies?
It's certainly one of them, right? I think that it's funny because if you ask pilots, and everybody around me is a pilot, we'll ask them, well, what's the thing when you're flying? There's kind of three components of flying: aviate, which is fly the airplane; navigate, figure out where you're going; and communicate. There's so much that's taught related to aviate and navigate, and almost nothing related to communicate. And so there's a lot of deference to tools out there. One of them is called Live ATC. So if anybody who's listening to this program wants to kind of figure out, well, what does it really sound like? They can go on Live ATC and listen to any airport virtually in the world. Wow. And listen to all these frequencies and just kind of get a feel for it. And then there's also a YouTube channel called VAS Aviation, and they catalog these abnormal or emergency flight situations. And so we've got wonderful data to source from nowadays for both routine flight and abnormal flight. However, when instructors are telling their students, oh, it seems like you're deficient in this, and we'll kind of, I'll give you a little bit of teaching, and then go listen to Live ATC for a while. And really what they're doing is they're training their ear to parse this language, but yet without the situational awareness of where this happens in space and the concepts that are, kind of undergirding. When they give you a heading change, we've talked about this, it's a specific number that's read a specific way, fly heading 030. Well, as a new flight student, you're flying the airplane, you're talking on the airplane, you're navigating, you're doing everything. In commercial flight, one guy is doing that, and the other guy is just, or man or woman, excuse me, is talking on the radio. So you have a speaking pilot. So you have a flying pilot and a speaking pilot. These poor flight training students, they got to do everything. And the instructor's sitting there next to them, evaluating them while they're doing it. So, it's kind of like patting your head and chewing gum and rubbing your stomach at the same time.
Robbie, I just wanted to add what Andy provided there. It helps us a lot with corpus collection. So Live ATC, amazing source. And for people who would like to start collecting and transcribing, that's one way of obtaining corpus. And so for us, because we subscribe and we follow and we look at what's going on, and we have that and we transcribe, we add new data to what we're collecting. And also really amazing that Andy with his corpus collected at Embry-Riddle with actual student interaction during training. I mean, he has an immediate area to compare, so this whole parallel corpus that will be available. So we have data available. Obviously, it's still going to be an issue when it comes to getting more and sorting them out. But, with Andy and Malila doing the work, we have models to follow and templates in a way to even utilize. And how do we begin working with aviation corpora?
Yeah, I was just thinking that how on earth do you get access to this data? I had no idea that you could actually listen in, eavesdrop on these live interactions. That is fascinating. And they're under so much pressure anyway. And so the idea that some random person anywhere in the world could just start listening in on them while they're working as well. I wonder how that makes them feel. That's really interesting, though. Eric, you've obviously been supervising Andy's work for some time now, but you've also conducted research together as well. Is that right?
Yes, yeah. Well, it's mostly now Andy telling me what to do.
Okay, fair enough.
Because he has one is he has both the linguistic and the content expertise. But yeah, it's really fascinating, and I'm learning a lot from what Andy is putting together. I'm so fascinated with. He didn't mention this, but Andy is also working with actual flights simulators. It is going to be another area for amazing for training, but another area where we can collect data for actual language, but it's not really flying per se, so there is that technology mediated kind of communication going on, and I look forward to getting more from Andy about the future direction of this research. Andy also is a member of we would like to give a shout out to the ICAO, International Civil Aviation Association. Malila and Jennifer, all of us are actually highly involved with this group. And really fascinating that members of the group are sharing their research. Many of them are working with corpus-based data. A lot of them are related to teaching international pilots and air traffic controllers. So, and it's just really fascinating. I hope we have more time. Unfortunately, it's just really that kind of thing, Robbie, that we don't have time. We focus on a lot of other areas, but it's been fun working with Andy, Rochelle, Jennifer, Malila, all of our colleagues and collaborators. It's really an amazing experience for me, especially.
Well, thank you, Eric, and thank you, Andy. It sounds absolutely fascinating, the work that you're doing. I wish we could speak for hours and hours about this, but thank you for joining us, Andy. We'll briefly say goodbye to you now. We'll say hello in a few moments' time. Thank you. So, Eric, we've just heard from two of your many colleagues in one of the many areas of research that you're involved in, and I feel like I've learned so much already. I kind of want to move to some broader issues as we start to wrap things up here. So much of your work is, of course, by its very nature, heavily applied. And even that word has become a little bit, I'm not sure if controversial is the right word, but there are different definitions of what does applied linguistics actually mean. I'm quite liberal, as I suspect you are as well, in terms of at any sort of application to any area, whereas there are others who might sort of think of applied linguistics much more in a kind of language learning sort of perspective. In so much of your work, you collaborate with other academic and non-academic partners. How do you navigate these relationships? You said at the beginning of our conversation, networks, building networks. How do you navigate these relationships, and what are the challenges you have when you, for instance, go to somebody in an industry and say, I've just observed these, I've made these findings about the language in your context, and here's what I've got to say. What are the challenges with this sort of work in this very collaborative nature that you work?
Great question, Robbie. It's and I'm with you in terms of the whole notion of applied. I'm very liberal about that too. I really have learned so much about networking and collaboration. We have a lot of colleagues. We offer a great skill, right? As applied linguists, we carry with us what linguistics mean and the approaches about linguistics. We present ourselves as researchers. We can help the applied side of it, as we can offer solutions, and we can offer especially pedagogy. This is what both Malila and Andy are doing. They're collecting real world data. It's naturally occurring, and here's what they can do to take that into the next level, which is teaching learners, right? In terms of addressing the industry, however, there will always be pushbacks, right? Sometimes it's always difficult to go into an area where there have been people working on it, and they may not have your same experience and background. My lesson and something that really worked, in my opinion, worked well for me, was to just really get to know the field, get to know the people, spend time presenting yourself and what you can do. I mean, we cannot just go in gung-ho, change the world. Here's how you best do it. I've experienced it when it comes to, assessment concerns in aviation, where based on my experience, some language experts came to a group and proposed ideas and solutions that were not necessarily connecting well with members of the group, right? And so I want us in our field, especially, this is the notion of English for specific purposes, where we are the language expert, but we need to really work well with the content expert. And we need the content expert to really embrace us and understand that we're there we can offer something, and that's how I pursue this. Like, here I am, I wanted to learn, I need to learn, I understand my limitations when it comes to not knowing the content yet, but I can help, and I'm here to understand that we can work together. So I approach it as that, like, I'm here, we can work together. I know I have a lot of things to learn, but here's what I can contribute. And it works in that context. And I still have a lot of things to learn, and maybe I can write about the whole experience later on.
It's so wonderful to hear somebody who I regard as being just amazing and inspirational in so many ways in terms of the career that you've had, be so open about, just saying things like, well, that I don't know about this, so, you need to teach me. I think that is such a refreshing and honest kind of way of working, and it clearly works really, really well, rather than to be tempted to claim to be the expert of absolutely everything, and to just remain open about, about what you still want to learn, and to be open to new things. So that's really, really great to hear, actually. And as we start to wrap up now, I want to give you my challenge of my quick questions, which is always how I end episodes. And I always say something about how the questions are quick, but maybe not the answers. But we'll see how you manage. I'm not going to time you, don't worry. So there's 3 of them. The first one is, what are the biggest changes you've noticed in corpus research during your career?
Yeah, it's, I guess I jumped to one big change, the internet sketch engine as the second one, and just really the notion of, like, you go online, there will be access to corpora, there will be access to tools, and it's amazing. And it worries me, Robbie, just because I feel like, wow, do I need to learn that, right? So a lot of things going on now. I read articles, I get new publications, and I know nothing about the tool. Compared to before, when I felt like, I attended a conference, I knew about the tool. Now there are so many. The other thing, I mentioned this earlier, natural language processing, computational linguistics, and corpus linguistics. I mean, we need to articulate what these things are, and what is corpus, what is NLP, and what is not NLP, what is not corpus. And with these things coming out, there are a lot of overlaps. My emphasis is just to really be able to, if you're doing corpus linguistics, then do corpus linguistics, but learn what it actually is. You cannot argue for, like, this is corpus linguistics just because I use text and, I use tools. And I feel like articulating that is very important. Sometimes you read what arguably would be a corpus linguistics paper, but then the citations are computation or NLP paper. There will be, those kinds of overlaps that are happening. Because the fields are really overlapping, if you may, and I feel like we need to further redefine and create a clearer articulation of what is corpus, what is not corpus linguistics.
I think that's a really good point. Related to that, I suppose, is, what is the biggest misconception of corpus linguistics that you have encountered?
That it's gonna change the world, I guess. I guess because that's what I thought before. Considering that I felt, especially in the late 90s, that that was amazing. Not that I don't believe in it anymore. I mean, I obviously still do, but it is a research approach, right? It is an approach it's something that will help us teach registers more, just like, again, what our two colleagues are doing, Malila and Andy, that to describe phraseology, to standardize the language of aviation, they go to Corpus, right? They go to their corpus, they go to what they have collected, and they argue for, like, this is how you best teach this, right? So I feel like that's, that's what we're doing. It's practical, it's functional, but it's teaching, it goes back to what we do as teachers. So it's very important, and it's near and dear to me, but it's not a revolutionary, world-changing thing. It's something that we just utilize because we have amazing data, and we know how to take it to the next level.
So in a way, you're saying that it's maybe closer to existing conceptions of language than perhaps you thought. Maybe the misconception is that you thought it was really, really different, but actually it's just a method for doing the kinds of work that people were doing anyway. Really.
In a way, yeah. And I sounded kind of dramatic there, Robbie. I did not want to minimize that. No. The doing side is already very important, and the doing side and the teaching side of it is already what I really wanted to achieve in the first place.
Okay, that makes sense. And finally, I'm very curious to hear your answer based on what you just said to this final question. How will corpus linguistics make an impact on the world in the future?
The applied side of corpus linguistics, to me, is really very, very important. And so the impact is how we can connect with policymakers globally. I'm really fascinated by the works of legal discourse analysts and how they make use of corpora in defining how legal terms and laws should be interpreted. And I think that's the way to go. Obviously, in the legal environment and in the field, they have various debates about this as well. Interpreting the intent of a law and something like that. But I feel like the debate and how corpora contributes to it, will be very, very important. I want, that I'm proud that what we're doing is trying to really successfully define what happens in communication events, with the understanding that we understand demographics. That's the notion of register, the Biber and Conrad definition of what is register in language. And I feel like that's very important. Language is mediated by register, what I say, what we don't say in a situation like this. It's because of the register that we're at. And I feel like that's what Corpus is telling us, so how do we take that into making communication as easier, as meaningful, as impactful, if I can use that word, as possible, is something that we can contribute using our field. And it will make the world better, in my opinion.
Well, I think that's a wonderful and optimistic way to end our conversation today. So thank you very much, Eric. And I'd like to bring in once again both Malila Prado and Andy Schneider. Thank you for joining us to contribute to this episode. And I hope also you enjoyed listening in on the rest of the conversations as well. So yeah, thank you very much to Eric, Malila, and Andy. This has been a first for us with having 3 guests spread across the globe as you are. But this has been really, really interesting, and I'm going to go off and listen to some live ATC, I think, and find out more about how all of that works. So thank you to our 3 guests, and of course, thank you to you, whether you're watching us on YouTube or listening to us on Spotify, Google Podcasts, Podcast Addict, or Podchaser. Do let us know your thoughts about this and other episodes using the hashtag CorpusCast, and make sure to check out the Aston Corpus Linguistics Research Group on Twitter at Aston Corpus. CorpusCast is an Aston Originals podcast written and hosted by me, Robbie Love, and produced by Sam Cook. Thank you for watching or listening, and thanks again to our three guests today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.